Goals of this lecture are to review important accounting concepts used in creating accurate budgets, and to emphasize the importance of true cost analysis or total cost analysis when generating budgets in a not-for-profit organization and seeking revenue to support those proposed activities. When we're budgeting expenses, we're really looking at the total costs involved in people, places, and things. As we discussed in the budgeting module, in most project and program budgets, people, places, and things get divided into two broad categories: personnel and other than personnel. And so in this lecture, what we're going to look at are some of the more detailed calculations that go into the costs that fall into both buckets of people and personnel, and making sure that we understand how to fully account for all of the associated costs around them. So one of the first things I want to talk to you guys about is fringe rates or fringe benefit rates. In addition to salaries, personnel costs are made up of benefit costs, and benefits include payroll taxes, insurance, pension, maybe a few other benefits or perks you provide your employees. So you come up with your fringe rate by taking total benefit costs and dividing them by total salaries. What you get is a percentage, and this percentage is an amount over and above the salary you pay an individual employee that the organization must incur in benefit costs to bring that employee on board. So if you're thinking that you can hire an assistant program director for $40,000 and you have a fringe benefit rate of 28%, you're actually looking at a personnel cost of $51,200, because 28% in addition to the $40,000 on that $40,000 has to be budgeted to bring that person on board to cover their insurances, the taxes, and any sort of contributions to the pension plan you might make. As a general rule of thumb, I would say that it is safe budgeting to estimate somewhere between 28 and 32% fringe rate for a not-for-profit organization that is bringing on a full-time employee and providing them with not only individual insurance but family insurance packages and any sort of 401k or 501(c)(3) support. Another concept that I think it's really important for students to get a handle on is the difference between fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs are costs that remain the same regardless of the level of activity. A basic example might be rent or your annual mortgage payment. No matter how many classes you run out of the building, no matter how many offices you fill until full occupancy, your rent cost or your mortgage cost remains the same. If you are understaffed and you only have 2 people using 2 of the 6 offices, your cost is still the same. If you have 6 people using all of the offices, your cost is the same. A variable cost, however, is a cost that fluctuates with the units of production or output. So, for example, if you own a building in which you conduct job training programs, it may not matter, assuming that you have the amount of space and room in your schedule, how many classes you offer. No matter how many classes you offer on a given day, your fixed space cost remains the same. However, if you provide every student in the class with a textbook, a calculator, and a package of pencils, then your supply costs will go up for every student you enroll. So you will have the fixed cost of your rent plus a variable cost for every student you enroll. The more students, the higher your variable cost. Where it's also important for you to understand is that some variable costs increase with output, but not in a 1-to-1 ratio. And we call these semi-variable or step costs, and you can see why. Step costs are where your cost per output goes up in lockstep amounts. So if we go back to the job training program and say that you have a set fixed cost for space, you have variable costs for supplies, perhaps your instructor costs are semi-variable. because you have an instructor who will teach a class of 25. But once it's more than 25, that instructor insists that you set up a next class. And say you pay that instructor $5,000 per class that they teach. So your instructor costs up until your first 25 students is $5,000. Once you hit 26 students, your instructor costs become $10,000. Same would occur once you hit 51 students. You would go from 10,000 to 15,000. So your instructor costs for job training programs are a step variable or a semi-variable cost that go up in blocks. The reason this is a really, really important concept is that it is with semi-variable costs that an organization can actually constructively manage its expenses and take advantage of cost efficiencies. So if it's $5,000 to teach 25 students and $10,000 to teach 26, it probably does not make sense for you to schedule a second class if you only have 26 students. At some point, however, you may hit a tipping point in where you are making more or breaking even on that second class. So in our example, if it costs, let's make the math simple, $1,000 to pay an instructor per class, and each student pays $100 to attend the class, it will take you 10 students to pay for your instructor. So instead of enrolling a second class at 26 students, it might make more sense not to start a second class until you have 36 students, because now you break even on your $1,000 instructor course. It's making these sort of decisions that can help an organization reach the maximum number of constituents while incurring reasonable costs or seeking to recapture reasonable costs. Another really important concept in correctly budgeting costs for new projects or new programs or across business areas or activities is cost allocation. And cost allocation is the process by which shared costs are broken up across business areas or across programs, and each program is assigned their fair share of the shared cost. Cost allocation can also be used when allocating direct and specific costs. They're not shared, but say you have a program director who works on two different programs. You need to decide, how do you break up their salary between the two programs when seeking grant support. So when allocating personnel costs, whether they're shared because it's the cost of the executive director who does marketing for all of the programs, or direct costs where they're salaried employees who wear multiple hats and work in multiple areas of the organization, there are a number of ways in which you can allocate salaries. You can do it by timesheet, and then most of us have seen this. If you're working on multiple projects, you come in and you have a timesheet and you say, Monday from 9 until noon, I worked on the after school program, and then I took a lunch break, and then from noon until 5, I worked on grant proposals for our Head Start program. So within that, you've now allocated your time between direct mission service delivery on the after school program and fundraising and development on the grant writing for the Head Start program. Another way organizations might do this is to conduct time studies. And time studies are recommended for an organization that it is just not feasible or reliable for its employees to come in and fill out detailed hour by hour, time by time schedules on a daily basis. So time studies are done where an organization will pick 2 or 4 weeks at different times throughout the year and require its employees to keep detailed timesheets. These timesheets are then brought together and amalgamated, and an average percentage of where that employee spends their time is created. And so for any given employee at 1 week each quarter when they've studied it, it works out that this one employee is, say, 60% program, 20% fundraising, and 20% board support and administrative costs. what you would do with that is you would then take that person's salary for the entire year and apply those broad percentages based off of the time study. And so for their $40,000 salary, you would apply 40% to program, 20% to admin and management, and 20% to fundraising and development. What is an important part of the time studies is that you get an employee attestation statement. An attestation statement is where this employee actually looks at the percentages and goes, yep, those make sense, and that seems reasonable and accurate for how I spend my day. The reason you want to do that is maybe perhaps by error or accident, you ended up with 2 of the weeks that you're tracking this employee being the week before the gala and the week before the annual appeal goes out. And this person's time is unusually skewed towards their fundraising activities in those 2 weeks. And then when they look at this and they say, oh my gosh, no, I don't spend 20% of my time fundraising. Those 2 weeks were just really, really heavy. Then you can go back and adjust. But you're giving the employee and management a chance to verify that your suggested allocation is reasonable and accurate. Now, you could think that you would just apply the exact same percentage as you've determined based on timesheets or time studies to fringe benefits, but you don't have to. You can do it, take total personnel costs and allocate them the same way so that the benefit costs follow the salary dollars. So if 40% of the salary is being allocated to program, then 40% of the benefit is being allocated to program. Another way of doing this, and it's not uncommon to be used by nonprofits with government contracts, is to allocate your benefit costs by full-time equivalent, or FTE. Because some contracts allow for a greater percentage of benefit costs to be recaptured. And so if you have one of those contracts and you're allowed to allocate by FTE, and you have a program that employs the equivalent of 50% of your staff based on the number of part-time and full-time employees that you use, it may be advantageous to your organization to apply benefit costs to a program at a greater rate than would be applied to that program if you simply tracked benefit dollars to salary dollars. Similarly, allocating indirect OTP or OTPS costs can be done based on salary dollars. So if you rent space and you need to allocate your rent costs to each of the 3 programs, and your first program represents 60% of your total salary are for people employed in that program, accounting allows you to say, and 60% of the space costs are now also assigned to that program. If you decided to use FTE for assigning your benefit costs, you may also decide to use FTE as a valid method for assigning all of your other shared costs, such as rent, utilities, telephone, etc., on the assumption that the greater number of bodies place a greater demand on utility space and other related costs, and you're just going to make a person-based allocation. Whether you use salary dollars or FTE, you use that allocation across the board, and your shared other than personnel costs will follow the same percentage breakdown as you end up allocating your salary and benefit costs. Another way you might do it, though, would be square footage, and for some organizations this is more accurate and more fair. So perhaps your after-school program takes up the entire gymnasium and the first and second floor of the building you rent, but it really only employs 8 of your 32 employees. Square footage is a better representation of the true cost of space and utilities for those programs than it would be just using salary dollars. Because if you only have 8 full-time employees working in the after-school program, you may end up underestimating the true rent and utility cost of those programs. So square footage may be a better representation of the total costs related to that program. Another third and often more complicated process is an actual facilities use study. Similar to a time study with individuals, it's sort of a sign-in sheet or checklist for all of your major spaces or equipment uses. So you might have the after-school program mark and sign that it uses the gymnasium from 4 to 7 Monday through Friday. And then based on that, they're being allocated their space costs for that program based on actual use. For most organizations, that's a little more complicated and doesn't necessarily result in a greater accuracy for the additional effort. But there are some cases, for example, when you have a bus and the bus works for the summer camp and is used extensively day in, day out, 3 different routes during the summer, but is only used once every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday during the school year, it may make sense to actually allocate cost usage by wear and tear and assign a greater portion to the summer camp, even though over the number of months it's a lesser calendar use of the vehicle. Another concept that I think it's useful for students to have in mind when they're creating budgets is reserves, and whether or not an organization can budget for reserves is sometimes open to debate or discussion. Quite honestly, you hear a lot of the time, we can't afford to create a reserve, or my board wants a balanced budget, or funders don't want to see a surplus. If they see that we have a surplus, they won't fund us as much next year. These may have been legitimate concerns, I would say 10, 15 years ago. But what I have seen over the maturity of the sector and the maturity of funders is that there is a real respect and understanding for the benefits of an unrestricted reserve, and that every organization should aim to add to its reserve account every year in some form or fashion. It can be done by saying a percentage of surplus will be added to our reserve account. So maybe we say 5% of any surplus of revenue over expenses will be added to our reserve account. Or maybe you actually include a line item in your budget that says additions to reserves, and you put in a dollar amount that you are going to aim to hit every year to put into your reserve account. Because reserves are really what allow an organization to weather storms or seize opportunities. And I can speak from personal experience working in New York after September 11th, when there was a period of time when government contracting froze. They were not paying for 90 days on extended contracts, and we did not know really what was going to happen. And so there were 2 types of organizations that were able to rise to the occasion. There were organizations that had a surplus and didn't have to go out and fundraise to provide the additional services they needed to provide in Battery Park or Chinatown. They just had the money in place to bring on the extra staff, to do the intake, to do the support services, to do the counseling. And those organizations were able to meet the needs of the community without going out to fundraise first. Most of those organizations were able to backfill what they spent from the September 11th funds. But if they hadn't been able to call on their own reserves to bring people in, they wouldn't have been able to provide those services. The other type of organization that was able to rise to the occasion were those that already had pre-existing and very strong funder relationships. And so by September 12th, there were organizations that could pick up the phone, and major funders could call the New York Community Foundation and say, we know we're going to need to provide X or Y service, and we need you to guarantee the expenses that we're going to start incurring today. Another concept that it's important for you to understand in creating a true and accurate budget is depreciation. And depreciation is a tool we use to capture wear and tear on long-held assets. So whether it's a building, a vehicle, a refrigerator, if you're a food service organization, It is an asset that you expect to have a useful life of a certain period of time, but then will ultimately need to be replaced. What accounting requires us to do is to take the total cost of that long-held asset and divide it over its useful life, and each year depreciate 1 year's use value. So at the end of the item's useful life, you will have depreciated its value off your books. For example, a carrier van might be assigned a useful life of 10 years and have an end of life sale value of $7,000. If its original price was $67,000, the annual depreciation cost would be calculated by subtracting $7,000, or its resale value at the end of its life, from the original $67,000, and then dividing the remaining $60,000 by the 10 years of its expected use to the organization. This would give us an annual depreciation value of $6,000, which should be included in the operating budget and applied in the future against the purchase of a new van. Ideally, if we actually fund the depreciation cost included in our budget each year, when that van does indeed reach the end of its useful life, the organization will have amassed at least $60,000 plus whatever it can sell it for to replace that van. Now, with inflation, the cost of replacing that van may be $70,000 or $75,000 10 years down the road. But instead of having to go out and raise that full $70,000 or $75,000, the organization begins with a capital expense budget of $60,000 to $67,000 to apply towards that new vehicle. So depreciation isn't an accounting game. It's not a not real cost, as some people might try to tell you when they're looking at a budget. Or what is the net revenue of the program before depreciation? That type of thinking often puts an organization in the hole down the road. So when you're thinking of new projects or programs and they involve purchasing equipment, it's really important for you to include depreciation costs in the annual budget of that project or program so that you are setting up your organization for future sustainability and capital health. So the takeaway for this lecture isn't that I expect you to be able to do all of these calculations or to miraculously transform into an accountant or bookkeeper. We went through the concepts pretty quickly, but what this lecture should have given you are a number of questions that you're going to want to ask both of yourself as you move through the class and of your colleagues as you start working towards developing new ideas and new projects to make sure that you have taken into account the total costs involved in an expansion or a new opportunity. Because these little things, failing to take into account the full costs of benefits, failing to fully understand how a variable or semi-variable cost can impact a growth strategy or growth pattern, or failure to understand how a fixed cost doesn't just go away if you cancel the class or you cut employees, can really lead to unexpected and unnecessary costs for an organization. It's really important for you to understand that when you're budgeting for today, you can't forget about tomorrow. And so finding ways to budget for or add to unrestricted reserves or a surplus and actually taking into account depreciation for replacement value of your capital assets are essential ways that budgeting makes you a better organization and understanding budgeting makes you a better manager.